I got out of service. I was 19 years old. I had been an indifferent student. I grew up in a practical environment. My father was first generation. My mother was first generation on her father's side. We lived outside of Chicago. They had lived in Chicago all their lives. I had one uncle who had graduated as an engineer from college. My father had a couple of years of high school and did very well in spite of that. But I looked to this uncle who had also been a Marine at the end of the First War. And I said, what do you think I should do? He said, kid, there's big bucks in metallurgy. You ought to try metallurgy. So I said, all right. So from various circumstances, I had been damaged while on duty in an accident. And while it didn't affect me very much at the time, eventually this was recorded before I got out of the Marine Corps. And so I was treated as a damaged veteran. So I had a special GI Bill program where I had to take a series of tests to see what I was capable of doing. And then they would rehabilitate me. And I took this series of tests and went in to see the individual in the VA office you can feature those old smoky brick buildings in downtown Chicago with old yellow oak desks, and this guy sitting behind it with his feet on the desk. And I said, okay, kid. He said, what do you want to do? And I said, what can I do? He said, kid, you can do whatever you want to do. What do you want to do? So I said, I think I'd like to do metallurgy. I didn't have a clue as to what I was talking about. And he said, all right. He said, we'll set you up to do metallurgy. He said, anything else you're interested in? And I said, I was thinking, well, I like to pick up arrowheads on my grandmother's. When I stayed at my grandmother's summer home every summer, there were sand dunes behind there blowing out, and there were arrowheads there. My father had a medical leave, was having some problems, and came down here for the winter. So we were here winter of 1940, I guess. I went to Catalina Foothills School the second year it was open. I guess I should confess I went out to the University Indian Ruin and picked up potsherds as an 11-year-old. I found that stuff very interesting. And I had a few books on archaeology when I was growing up. So I mentioned archaeology and mentioned a couple of other things. And if I'd had any brains at all, I would have mentioned geology, which I was also very interested in. But I was just on the spot. And, what else are you interested in? And I didn't think it meant much. So, as it turned out, I was in metallurgical studies for a couple of years and discovered I didn't have much of a bent for chemistry. I was at Colorado Mines briefly and became very interested in geology, had a terrific geology instructor and a chemistry instructor who was not terrific. So I phoned the VA office in Denver and said, I'd like to change my program to geology from metallurgy. And he said, wait a minute, kid. He said, we can't have you guys all over the map. So let me get your record. So he brought out the record of that interview. You didn't say anything about geology in your interview. He said, we can't have you changing your mind. So I said, what did I say? And he read down the list. He said, archaeology. I said, that's great. I said, I'll do that. And that's how I came into archaeology. And I ended up at New Mexico. And I guess the most exciting part of the program there for me was the field school, the advanced field school in the summer that I attended in the summers of 1950 and 1951. It wasn't really much of a field school. We sort of learned on our own. We had a professor who was not always completely with it, but that convinced me that archaeology was what I wanted to do. There were some good courses in the anthropology department at that point, and I think probably the most interesting and stimulating were Leslie Spear's courses in ethnology of Western America and ethnology of Africa. Those were the days when people still taught ethnology. When I graduated from New Mexico, I wanted to take some time out. I spent a year in Washington, where my first wife came from and where her family was. And I learned very quickly that a BA in anthropology was a key that opened all doors. I became a typist for the Copyright Office, addressing envelopes with one finger. I had a disabled veterans preference, so I could be hired as a congressional hire right off the street. And then I worked at Army Map Service for a while as a photogrammetric interpreter, and that was fun. But I did want to go on to graduate school and get a degree, and I was accepted in the program at Michigan, which was a strong choice for me, and started in the program there in the fall of, must have been the fall of '53, and went through the doctoral program at Michigan. And my main sponsor was Jimmy Griffin, and I think the person in archaeology I was more closely associated with was Albert Spaulding. And they both had considerable influence on my thinking. I could identify with Jimmy because he was a man who could remember artifacts in a remarkable way. And I was very much artifact oriented and always have been, and probably still am. And Albert was sort of a kind mentor. I was his research assistant for a number of years, and he was more oriented toward problems and quantitative interpretation, and that's where I picked up my bent in that direction. I was a Logan Museum Fellow at Beloit College, was my first full-time teaching position. And the second semester I was at Beloit College, virtually the entire faculty went to Mexico with students on a field session. And I was the Department of Anthropology at Beloit College that semester. That position was supposed to enable me to finish my dissertation, but it didn't work that way. After Beloit, I was hired at Chicago, where I taught for 3 years. And at the end of those 3 years, Spalding left Michigan, and I was asked to replace Spalding at Michigan. It wasn't very difficult to leave the environment of the city of Chicago on the south side at that point. So I taught at Michigan for 6 years. I had tenure at Michigan. And we had a son who had severe asthma. And we were eventually told that we had a choice of putting him on heavy doses of cortisone or finding a better climate for him. And at the AAA meetings that winter, that November, I guess it was, in 66, I had a talk with Ray Thompson. I had written to a number of the departments in the Southwest because I always wanted to come back to the Southwest after New Mexico. And I met with Ray and we had a little discussion, and shortly after he came back down here, he communicated that they would be happy to hire me. And they matched my salary, which was very nice at that time, the salary I had at Michigan, but because of the level of the salary, they had to, Ray phoned me somewhat apologetically and said, because of your salary level, we can't hire you as an associate professor. We have to hire you as a full professor. Is that all right? And I assured him that was all right. So I got here in the fall of '67 with a stop that previous semester in New Mexico, where I and my family and some students lived in Deming from January until May. And I had arranged to do a survey in the Mimbres area as a way of moving out of Ann Arbor and into the Southwest. So I got to the department here, found a much smaller faculty than I was accustomed to at Michigan. And I can remember we had our faculty meetings in room 219, and there were lots of empty chairs. That became a seminar room since then. And I got to know, for the first time, I had met Emil earlier, but got to know him much better. And Harry Getty and Clara Lee Tanner and Ned Spicer and Fred Hulse comprised the main part of the department. I was hired the same year that Keith Basso and Paul Turner were hired. And Herman Bleibtreu had been hired this semester before. And that was pretty much the department as I remember it at that point. It grew very rapidly after that. It was a period of expansion of academia. There was a lot of interpersonal relationship between people in the more prominent departments and the administration. And it was possible to work at a personal level, I think, in terms of building a program. And there was, I think, a fair bit of money available because there were lots of students who were trying to stay out of Vietnam. So from that time on, I was a full-time faculty member here, except for sabbaticals, which I welcomed enormously. And as soon as I got here in '67, I began the program of excavation at Tabun in Israel. And that went on every summer we had 12-week seasons because it wasn't worth taking people that distance at that point. That's where I got into a very bad pattern. I would throw my grades into the office as I was on the way out the door to go to the field, and I would generally get back about a week late to start classes. And I never caught up after that, after those 6 years. Tabun fell on me at a cocktail party. A French prehistorian, Jean Perrault, was teaching. He was a good friend of Braidwood's. And when I was back in Ann Arbor after having been in Chicago, Perrault came over and taught for a semester, and we became good friends. About that time, a program was developed by the State Department to spend funds in countries that were being given American aid. They were called block funds, and there were lots of them in places like India and Egypt, and there were a lot of them in Israel. And Perrault was very much aware of what was going on because he had been at Chicago, and Sal Tax at Chicago had some hand in this kind of thing. And I had excavated with Francois Borde, who I had gotten to know when he was in a teaching position for a semester at Chicago. And we became good friends. And he wanted me to come to France to dig. And so when I got back to Michigan and was no longer a New World archaeologist at Chicago, I was able to go to France and excavate with Borde. And Madame Borde and Perrault were very good friends and worked together on typology and that sort of thing. So that there was this sort of small association. And Perrault said to me, "Oh, you should come to Israel. Come and dig Tabun," he said. Well, Tabun was the most important Paleolithic site in Israel, and I had one season of field work with Francois Borde in a Paleolithic site in France, and I thought that was ridiculous. But Perrault said, "Oh, there's all this money." He said, come look around," and so on. So in 1966, I went over to look around. And the summer went on, and I didn't see anything that was particularly promising. And Perrault took me and a student who came with me on an excursion of the Holy Land, which one could do before the '67 war. And one day from the Negev up to the north, and having a sense of drama, he arranged it so the day ended on Mount Carmel at the at the caves with the sun setting over the Mediterranean in this enormous cave in a cliff, 60 feet from top to bottom, and a profile there with vegetation growing all the way down it. And I looked at it and I thought to myself, it would take a madman to try to do anything here. And I went to talk to the noted prehistorian Moshe Stekalis, who had control of all prehistory in Israel at that point. And he said, you want to dig? Why don't you go to the back dirt at Emil and Kabara? I think there are lots of artifacts there you can find. Well, this was the notion that it was the artifacts that were important and the context didn't matter so much. So I got back here to Tucson, and Perot says, well, apply to excavate at Tabun. And so I sent an application with some design of what to do, and I got a letter from Stekalis, who was on the Antiquities Board, as was Perot. He said, if I had known, if you had said to me you wanted to dig it, apply new scientific techniques to dig at Tabun, I would have told you, yes, you can dig a 10-centimeter column down the profile. And that was my last communication with Stekalis. And along about December, I got a letter from a young fellow who had agreed to serve as an assistant on the project. I don't know whether it was a letter or a telegram, but it was only 3 words, and that is, Stekalis is dead. And that left Perot as the only prehistorian on the Antiquities Board. And Perot strongly promoted the project and was instrumental in getting the whole thing started and helping build a field laboratory at the site and all kinds of other things. And the next spring, was spring of '67, I was in Israel, ready to start, and a number of people were on their way. And then came the '67 war. So everything stopped, and I got back over there early in August, late in July, early in August, and we got the project moving, and went on from there. But it was, that's how Tabun started, and it was Perot approaching me at a cocktail party in Ann Arbor saying, why don't you come and dig Tabun? I, for many years, taught the core course in archaeology here. So I was exposed to, and by, all of the incoming graduate students. And I think some of them found my courses interesting and the subject matter interesting. And they found the notion of a project in some foreign land intriguing. Although I will say it became difficult to find the best qualified people sometimes because of the difficulties that were going on politically and militarily in the Near East at that point. It was right after our first scheduled day of excavation at Tabun turned out to be the first day of the 6-Day War. And there's some other stories about that, but anyway, as things went on, because of the way journalism exaggerates a situation, it was sometimes difficult to persuade students that going to Israel was no different than going to Vietnam. Whereas I think we heard hostile artillery fire just once the whole 6 years and we were up on the north border, and it was nothing. We did have a lot of jets flying over us on the way to the Suez frequently in the earlier years of that sort of thing. But there was never any real difficulty there. But it's a lesson in how the real world is and what journalists will lead you to believe. That saddled me with material for many years. And I was writing and analyzing and writing and analyzing for a very long time. And in 1981, board paid us a visit here. He had lectured in the department here a number of times. He spent a semester here in 69, 68, 69. And he was staying with us for a visit here, had a heart attack, and was hospitalized for quite a while, came home, and his wife came over to see him, and the next night he died. The Guggenheim Fellowship enabled me to coordinate and make data accessible from the Tabun excavation, basically. It gave me support through a semester, or I guess it was a whole year. It was a whole year to do that. Without that outside support, I'm not sure how long it would have taken to get access to the information that was in the records from the excavation. That's basically what it did. I'm not sure what it was. I can't remember what it was supposed to do. I don't think they would have given me the money to do that. I probably said I was going to write some kind of synthesis about Neanderthal behavior on the basis of material from Tabun, which eventually I did a couple of times, although not in a comprehensive volume like Quina. I had wanted, before I finished a field career, to dig a small site in France, just because. And we had talked about that a little bit. Went over to France to look at collections the summer after that poor died, and didn't really talk about a site or anything. And when I got back here, Dibble went with me as assistant, and I got back here and I was saying, well, it would, before more time passes, it would be good to see if I could arrange something like that. But there wasn't anything promising that summer. And I had looked at the map and so on. I said, maybe I could go and see what's in Portugal, because nobody had produced much in the way of a Paleolithic record in Portugal. So I arranged a seed grant from a foundation of my friend Agnese Haury, and went to France. I had written to a couple of the prehistorians I knew to see if they knew a small site that might be suitable for a season or two of excavation. And I had met the curator of prehistory at the National Museum in Paris the summer before, and he was one of the people I wrote to, and he was first person I saw when I got back to France, and went in to see him along with Harold Dibble. And Harold had a new Radio Shack portable computer, the TRS 100, and had that with him. We went in to see Henri Delport, and Harold was showing him things could be done. Oh, that was highly interesting to Delport. And then Delport sort of sat back and said, well, I understand you would like to dig a site in France. I said, yes, sir. Something small, maybe. He said, tell me, he said, what is the most important Paleolithic site in France outside of the Périgord? Middle Paleolithic site. I said, I suppose that would have to be La Quina. He said, exactly right. He said, it seems the museum has acquired La Quina in a bequest from the Henri Martin family, and we would like to have the section clarified in a new excavation. But would you be interested in excavating at La Quina? And I was similar to struck on the head. And so I backpedaled as fast as I could, and I said, well, I said, I would have to see the site and the situation and all of that before I could give you any kind of answer. Exactly right, he said. So La Quina fell on me. Ultimately, there was a lot of bureaucratic haggling and stuff back and forth. But I guess he was impressed with what I had done at La Quina. And eventually I ended up excavating at what I had done at Tabun. And eventually I ended up excavating at La Quina. Several things. We clarified the sequence, of course. And I was able to demonstrate, again, I became interested in mass of material. There were different kinds of material being used by the Neanderthals, who were always on a circuit as hunter-gatherers. And the different kinds of materials were from sources that we didn't really locate very well. We weren't able to do a material survey. Subsequently, a student from Paris did such a thing, and I was able to utilize, he went through our collection without asking. This is a long story. The collection went back to the museum in Saint-Germain. They transported it from our laboratory in the boxes in which it was stored down in the Charente. They did not have the database that went with the material. They just assumed that everything in a box came from a layer that was on the box. And the young person who did the study didn't use any of the individual artifact numbers. So he just did masses of material from these boxes. So the study is not very good. But he did identify material sources in the country. And from the way he wrote it up and described the materials, I realized which ones they were from my classification, because they were pretty close in physical features. And I was able to show eventually that one can estimate the total amount of cortex that one would expect on a mass of material, and one could observe the amount of cortex that was present, that is the outside rind on a flint nodule, and that using these two things together, one could compute relative distance from the site, relative distance the material had been transported, because it was being reduced along the way. That's one contribution. Another is that at Tabun we didn't weigh any of the specimens, we just measured them. There weren't accurate scales that you could use fast at that time. Digital scales didn't exist at that time. But at Quina I was able to weigh artifacts. So I had mass controlled by weight. I also measured length, width, thickness on all the artifacts. And I discovered a relationship, a principle, and that is that the log of length times width times thickness correlates with the log of weight. And I demonstrate this in the monograph. And this is something that could be used to estimate mass for older collections that have just been measured. And I've been able to apply it to the Tabun material, for instance. But it also is something that really ought to be important for people doing lithic analysis to realize this, that there is a consistent relationship here, because the log of length times width times thickness leads to a distribution that's absolutely normal. And one can apply classic parametric statistics to comparisons of this, whereas weight and the log of weight is highly skewed and is much more difficult to do comparisons with. And I thought that was kind of a nice contribution. None of the reviewers of the volume seem to have noticed any of these things. I don't think any of them really read the volume. It's the same with the volume on the Middle Pecos material. It was never reviewed. Anyway, these are the kinds of things that I remember fondly, and I thought people might find interesting, and maybe they will sometime. One thing that you can tell if you have a program where you're introducing length, width, thickness of artifacts and weight, if you do a computation of these things, of the relationship, and if it's beyond a certain level either way, you've got an error in one of your measurements. And you can make the computer buzz if you do it right. And I was able to show at Quina the way industries change with the depositional environment, with the situation in which they were used, made, and left. There are situations in which the discarded material is not accessible anymore, or accessible to a greater degree, or it's obvious there for a long time. And you can see different levels of reduction of the lithic material based on the depositional history. These kinds of things. Nobody seems to have mentioned that either. I remember very well how I was introduced to her. I had known Bear Bannister from a conference or two before I came here. And we were invited for dinner at the Bannisters, and he said, you know, a couple who knew I had been to Turkey and were very interested in Turkey. And would I bring some slides over from Turkey? So I did. I'm sure too many slides, all of that. But the couple was Agnese and her husband, Chip Lockwood. And somehow Aggie thought what I was saying was interesting, or that sort of thing. And eventually we were in social contact quite a bit. We had a house in the foothills, not very far from where she lived, where Vivi lives now. So we were geographically close together, and we saw a fair bit of them. And, eventually, Aggie decided to, when she was, after she divorced Chip and married Denver, I guess she and Denver talked about things that she could do that would be beneficial. Up to that point, she was giving money to people to do interesting things. So she decided to form the foundation. Bannister, a lawyer she had from New York, John Lowenthal, and Alger Hiss, who was a very old friend. She had been Alger's secretary at the Carnegie Institute before all of Alger's troubles. And we were all on the board of the foundation, along with a couple of other people who were very sensitive to social problems and needs from other parts of the world. So that was part of my acquaintance with Aggie, and just knew her personally for a long time, and eventually tried to keep her going, tried to keep her as active as she could be. She was remarkable. She visited both Tabun and Quina. She was at Tabun the last day of, she and Chip were at Tabun the last day of excavation at Tabun. Anyway, so we did know each other pretty well. Oh, just as a visitor. They were just visiting. I think they were coming through from Turkey or somewhere at that point. They were doing lots of other things. She was in the laboratory at, I block on the name, Snaketown. She was part of Emil's project at Snaketown. Emil knew Chip because Chip came out to the first field school at Point of Pines in '46. I don't remember the exact circumstances by which, I've heard her talk about it, but they came out to work with Emil at Snaketown. Chip ran heavy equipment, among other things. And Aggie worked in the lab with the ceramics, I think, primarily. So that's where she first got to know Emil, and was always very impressed with Emil, as we all were. He was unique, but so was she.